What is society across the globe interested in and demanding? What are the sort of galvanizing issues that are capturing public attention that private companies can help fulfill? Because companies can provide the goods and services that people are demanding. And when you see shifts in kind of global public opinion, it means that there's really this capacity to convince governments also to shift in the way that they are governing around the world, or the way they're cooperating around the world. Private companies can fulfill that demand. And so I think it's really important that companies are thinking about, how can we serve this planet, this earth that we live on, in a way that is also satisfying to global civil society.
This is terrific, because in a business school, we love to teach our future business leaders key competencies. This is almost saying we should be teaching them public diplomacy. In many ways. And how do we do that? Welcome to International Business Today, where we discuss the most critical issues in international business with top academic experts and thought leaders. I'm Paula Caligiuri, a professor in the International Business and Strategy Group at Northeastern University's DeMoore McKim School of Business. Today, I am so happy to be joined by Mai'a Davis Cross, the Dean's Professor of Political Science, International Affairs, and Diplomacy at Northeastern University, where she also directs the Center for International Affairs and World Cultures. Her research focuses on international cooperation, European foreign and security policy, and space diplomacy. She's a lifetime member of the Council on Foreign Relations and has authored several books, including her latest book, International Cooperation Against All Odds, The Ultra-Social World. Mai'a, welcome to International Business Today.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
I'm so excited to talk about this concept of being ultra-social, this ultrasociality. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so ultrasociality is really defined as this human tendency across our whole species to be other-regarding, empathic, to really strive to cooperate when the opportunity presents itself. And the reason that I really wanted to investigate this phenomenon is that in my field of international relations, the kind of default assumption is that we as humans are actually prone to conflict and selfish competition, and we behave in power-hungry and untrusting ways. Except in so much of my research, I saw that there were these amazing, unexpected outcomes of cooperation, and I wanted to understand if really we should be starting at a different place in terms of understanding how we go from being human beings on the planet to actually making breakthroughs in international cooperation. And what I found from this research is really there's such a large consensus in so many different disciplines that we actually are ultrasocial. And if that is the tendency, I think that should be our starting point in understanding international outcomes.
That is such a beautiful position to start from, right? That we are inherently wanting the best for each other and to cooperate and build trust with each other. But how do you see that play out in global cooperation through institutions or what?
Sure, yeah. And so that is a big challenge actually for my work, because I'm drawing on these other fields like social neuroscience, cognitive psychology, brain science, anthropology, and how do you scale up these findings to international relations?
Yeah, right.
It's not a direct line. Actually, if you did make it a direct line, that would be implying some sort of biological determinism, and I don't think that's true at all. I think we as humans, we obviously have agency individually and collectively. And so what I did in the book is I developed a theory about the power of ideas. How is it that we are able to express our ultra-social tendency? Essentially, it's through this power of ideas, that if there is this idea that's really galvanizing, that sparks a kind of transnational societal movement.
Greater good type.
Exactly, that inspires people to think about the power of possibility, to imagine a better future for all of humanity, that this is the way you scale up ultrasociality into practice, that we, in effect, as overall, we tend to be drawn to ultrasocial ideas or ideas that allow us to express our ultrasocial behavior and tendency. And of course, I would definitely caution that, many times we do not behave according to this tendency. Obviously, the reason why my field has made these assumptions about selfish and violent competition is because that has often occurred in international relations. My theory actually tries to account as well for these, what I call tribalistic outcomes.
Depends on the unit.
Exactly.
Depends on the group that you're trying to maximize the social.
Yeah, it's exactly the same kind of tendency, our sense to want to belong to something bigger. But sometimes we get drawn into these situations where there are manipulative leaders who almost want to weaponize the empathy that we want to have, that sort of manipulate us into things that actually turn out to be the opposite of ultrasocial behavior. So I think it's really important to account for both. But if we have this new starting point, we're more likely to actually understand how we get to cooperation. We can spotlight the things that work rather than just focusing on why things go wrong. And that's kind of the effort that I pursue in the book.
It's a fantastic effort and it sounds like a fantastic book. I can't wait to read it. But let's actually talk a little bit more concretely about examples of this. Where are you seeing this, especially on a global scale?
Sure. Yeah. And I think the global scale is often the most challenging because it's not every day that you see this major breakthrough in international cooperation. But I can talk about a range of examples. I mean, I think one of the most compelling examples is actually the history of space exploration and how we ended up in the situation we are in today and how we've actually misunderstood what happened in the space race during the Cold War. And so the origins of space exploration were actually fundamentally cooperative and ultrasocial. I would put that time period around the 1920s when the idea first emerged of spaceflight, that humans could pursue traveling to distant planets, at least to the moon, onto Mars. This was clearly articulated in the 1920s, and it was so galvanizing that it sparked a spaceflight movement. And the core underpinning of this movement was not only that people would go to space, but that it would be for all humankind to share in this endeavor to really kind of discover the origins of life and the functioning of the universe and to break the boundaries of what's possible.
So what happened? In the 20s.
So in that period of time, as you can imagine, when the first kind of space enthusiasts talked about rocketry and exploration, they were labeled as like a bunch of fringe crackpots. In effect, people said, this is crazy, this is impossible. But more and more people became excited about the possibility. They saw it as aspirational, positive, and transformational, and a way to express ultrasociality. So eventually they were able to form a kind of federation across countries that pursued spaceflight together. They were able to achieve actual spaceflight eventually. And then you kind of think about the space race and sort of...
So the opposite of it.
Opposite, right? Yeah, exactly. That the space race we think of as just this cutthroat competition between the US and the Soviet Union. But when I actually dove into the archives and looked at the correspondences and the meetings between the Soviet Union and the US, I discovered that actually they were trying to cooperate at every possible opportunity.
Really?
In fact, at one point, it was official bipartisan policy of the United States to pursue a joint US-Soviet moon landing. And that's just kind of one example. Obviously, that didn't actually work out, but the aspiration of it kind of broke down some boundaries such that people could imagine other things in the future, like Apollo-Soyuz and eventually the International Space Station. So I would say that ultimately the International Space Station is kind of the final expression of that movement from 100 years ago, that this would be cooperative, it would be for everyone, it would be about scientific discovery. And that kind of set of principles and values that stem from the spaceflight idea and ultrasociality exists today. And they're very important in pushing back against some of the narrative that has emerged about space as the next battlefield.
Right. So this is interesting, though. How how do we overcome those challenges so we don't kind of pull into our separate corners?
Yeah, well, I think the first step is really awareness that we are an ultra-social species. I think that has not been really publicly visible. It's not necessarily taught in schools. And I do think that it's important to start rethinking some of the ways that our institutions function with assumptions about kind of the conflictual competitive nature of human beings, and instead focus on the way that education can nurture the social mind, that, institutions can value the possibilities that come out of our desire to work together. So rather than sort of approaching things as hard bargaining or kind of the assumption that you can't really trust others to abide by norms, we would actually enter into dialogue and deliberation and diplomacy with ultrasociality in mind. So it would take a lot of work, I think, to really kind of shift the way in which we think about international relations. Because again, as I started off with, in my field of international relations, these assumptions about conflict and violence have also become baked into the way policymakers often think about how they should behave on the international stage. And you see that language of what's called neorealism really coming to the surface far too often compared to, what's really possible. And there's far less of a focus on all the major achievements. So besides space, I've also looked at the nuclear weapons taboo, the climate change regime, the very formation of the European integration project. In each of these cases, we tend to think these were sort of issue areas really characterized by conflict. But if you go one level below the surface, you start to really see that this was very much about this sort of desire to have an optimistic, hopeful vision of the future that would bring people together in ways that are productive for humanity.
Wow. There's so much here. I mean, optimistic couple, we want this, right? And I'm imagining a business leader listening to this might say, yeah, sounds nice, but it sounds a little naive. What can we in business learn from some of these cases that you've shared?
Yeah, I mean, I think in all of the cases that I've looked at, business has played a role. And I think that is important to recognize. And I think the role could be kind of multifaceted in a way. I mean, first of all, I would say, if you look at today's example of space, for example, a case we're already kind of discussing here, that, one of the most stunning developments in the last 10 years or so is this growth, this rapid growth of the space economy. And that is largely driven by private companies and startups. And so I think that there's an important role here when you look at, will this be Space Age 2.0 or Space Race 2.0? The private companies really pull us towards a space age because they tap into sort of the ways in which we can think about the future of our species in exploration, in going to the moon and onto Mars. They make these technological breakthroughs. And for sure, governments have played a role in paving the way to enable space companies to really sort of spearhead something that's profitable in its own right, but also benefits humanity.
It benefits humanity. So SpaceX, I guess, would be a great example. Can you go into that?
So, and it's certainly not without controversy when you talk about SpaceX. But I mean, one of the things that is really valuable about that company is all of the breakthroughs that they've made, especially reusable rockets, making space travel far less expensive. I mean, it's expected that by 2040, the cost of launching rockets will go down by 90%.
Wow.
And that is a tremendous advantage for all sorts of companies that want to operate in space. And these companies, these technological advancements and scientific discoveries that companies are spearheading all come back to Earth with benefit for us, just as the Apollo era brought so many technological advances to us on Earth. This is occurring again. But it pulls us towards space as a place for humans to explore, to potentially live someday, also to use resources that are scarce on Earth to bring these resources back that will enable us, hopefully, to live better lives. The thing that's going a bit wrong with SpaceX is just the the large share of the market that this company has in particular. It's just so dominant, and you would really like to see other big players simultaneously. And to be sure, there are thousands of companies around the world, startups as well, all contributing to the space economy. But with SpaceX kind of dominant in this area, it tends to be a little difficult for other new players to come on the scene and to compete.
Yeah.
But to get back to your question on, what can global business leaders learn about, how to operate based on this ultra-social world we live in? I mean, I would suggest that they should really, have their fingers on the pulse of what is society across the globe interested in and demanding? What are the sort of galvanizing issues that are capturing public attention that private companies can help fulfill? Because companies can provide the goods and services that people are demanding. And when you see shifts in kind of global public opinion, it means that there's really this capacity to convince governments also to shift in the way that they are governing around the world, or the way they're cooperating around the world. Private companies can fulfill that demand. And so I think it's really important that companies are thinking about, how can we serve this planet, this earth that we live on, in a way that is also satisfying to global civil society.
This is terrific, because in a business school, we love to teach our future business leaders key competencies. This is almost saying we should be teaching them public diplomacy.
Yeah,
in many ways. And how do we do that? So,
no, absolutely.
I want us to teach that.
I think this notion of, I don't know what we would call it, maybe corporate diplomacy or private diplomacy, commercial diplomacy. There are many ways that we could think of this, but I think it's a kind of untapped area of business potential. And I think that being able to have students learn about how companies you cannot just operate in kind of a silo, that really it is so necessary in a very globalized world to be able to interact transnationally with companies doing similar things, or, other organizations that are compatible in terms of goals, and governments. And, especially when you think about areas that are not regulated enough, that are at the cutting edge of technology like AI or space, having representatives of companies, of businesses who are able to engage in diplomacy across all these professional boundaries to advocate and to communicate what companies need to move forward is crucial. And so these are skills of communication, of empathy, of persuasion, of being able to translate what can often be very technical goals within a company to, the general public. So public diplomacy as kind of a subset within classical diplomacy is a little distinct. It's not often associated with private companies.
Right. Because we don't, it doesn't come up in business too much, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it's because, one of the key principles of public diplomacy. So public diplomacy can be either people to people engagement or government to people, but it's foreign publics, governments to foreign publics, because it is a diplomatic kind of interaction. The key principle about these processes is that they should be honest, they should be legitimate, they should reflect the identity of the people involved. And with companies, the goal primarily is usually profit. So the public diplomacy angle is closer actually to branding or place branding, which shares some principles with public diplomacy,
reputation,
but it's not quite the same. Yeah. But I think there's no reason why on some level companies cannot also share their honest struggles, their efforts to kind of resonate with the global society, global public opinion, their efforts to fulfill demands that arise. And so I think maybe some kind of hybrid between kind of the standard branding or place branding and the public diplomacy outreach could be present for.
That's a nice balance. I like that.
Yeah.
Mai'a, you're so great at kind of seeing around, like, what's next? What's coming around the corner? What do you see coming in like geopolitical trends? I mean, we just had an election in the United States. We have a new administration as this episode's releasing. So
there's a lot to talk about when it comes to geopolitical trends. And we're really at this moment of flux because the US election just occurred. So I would say that one of the major trends in the world that has been going on for some time is the increase in polarization within societies. You see this, in Western democracies as well as in more authoritarian countries, and polarization across countries that have different value sets. So I think that is a real challenge. It is a trend that is going to continue, especially with the results of the US election. And then I would say the rise of China is absolutely crucial to pay attention to, with China and, from a business perspective, all of the goods that it is trying to sort of trade with others, and at the same time engaging often in unfair trade practices and violating kind of international standards on labor. This is a geopolitical trend where it affects both security and economic well-being on the planet. On the plus side, I think China is quite committed to developing certain environmental technologies. I think it's doing that mainly for its own bottom line, but nonetheless, if that's what gets you there,
right?
That can be helpful. But there is definitely the distinct possibility of actual on-the-ground conflict and war coming up because of, in part because of the U.S. election, but also just the sort of tensions that have been arising throughout the world. And like I write about in my book, there are certain periods of time in which we as a human society lean more towards ultra-social tendencies. We're more easily able to express those ideas and behaviors. And at other times where more of the world is kind of drawn into this tribalistic us versus them, I think that the latter actually has the seeds of its own destruction inherent in it. But we have to wait through these.
But we're waiting through, we're swinging there right now, if you will.
Yeah.
I think many people would be asking, how long will we be swinging? How much more time?
Yeah. I think it's, the election in the United States was so pivotal here, and unfortunately, it doesn't bode well in that sense. And I think a big question will be, will he follow through? Will Trump follow through with the things that he said he wanted to do during the campaign? And if that's the case, then polarization is here to stay for quite some time, and the risk of conflict and war goes up. There is always hope in all of this, though, and I think it's so important that we focus on areas of possibility and hope in all of this, because we still have transnational networks of people working on incredibly important issues, and they can continue to pursue those goals, mitigating climate change, working on human rights, preventing democratic erosion, and so forth. There are many goals that people across the world are working on, and I think they might become even more passionate about their causes and really gather more people interested in helping in reaction to the tribalistic kinds of developments that are occurring. So there is a silver lining to that when you get these kind of strongmen leaders who are really trying to promote the us versus them dynamic and even willing to go to war for it, that there's always a backlash to that. And it's in that backlash that people really rediscover what matters and how they want to live their lives.
Mm-hmm. And I hope within that, the multinational companies will respond, because it's within their best interest to also be a part of this cooperation and ultra-social.
Absolutely.
I want the global economy to stay as well.
For sure. The global economy is incredibly important. And it's an area where even when there is conflict, you can still have ties that are economic across borders. And it happens to benefit everyone. So it's an area sort of like, I would draw some analogy to science diplomacy. And in the field of science diplomacy, it's a little bit insulated from the politics of the moment, because science is so
on its own
plainly, beneficial to everyone. And so I think with economic ties and businesses, they play a role just naturally in existing and reaching out across borders. They can also play a leadership role too. And that's one thing that's really important. We don't have to just ride the tide of ultra-sociality versus tribalism. It's not structural. It's in the hands of leaders to push for things, to articulate transformational ideas, to inspire people to pursue different kinds of goals that are more productive. So I really think that, it's all hands on deck, and global business leaders who have this advantage of being able to see the whole world and where these ties are and how globalization functions in practice, they do have the power to really weigh in and try to make things lean towards, progress and peace and cooperation. And they should be at the table at various international fora to weigh in on what's needed.
Yeah. I teach a class called Becoming a Global Leader, which I joke is like one of the most pretentiously named classes ever, but you've inspired me to include this in my class, because I think it is important for our future business leaders to realize they can also be part of the solution, and an ultra-social one. So I'm curious about AI and tech. It seems like AI tech is changing everything as we know it.
Yeah.
Will it affect diplomacy, ultra-sociality?
I think it's really growing into this kind of almost overwhelming role at the moment, in part because there isn't a lot of regulation. There's not a lot of knowledge of where things are headed, but the potential is there too. And sort of the ways in which we can kind of have faster ways of processing information and knowledge, and having computers and technology take on some of the sort of like more straightforward tasks that could be achieved by them. So I think I think it is something that we all have to grapple with, but at the same time, it can't fundamentally change diplomacy and international cooperation, because you need that human to human interaction. You need to feel the power of the networks. I talk a lot about social power and how this can emerge out of people really building trust and relationships and seeing common goals, refining those goals over time, inspiring each other. And you could do a little bit of that on social media, but at the same time, social media can also be somewhat atomizing, because you tend to consume it kind of individually and only through a screen.
And through a filter bubble.
Yeah, the algorithm
pulls you more and more tribal.
Yes, absolutely. That ability to sort of rapidly spread misinformation, to manipulate people into seeing only certain parts of the interactions of the world and only certain viewpoints, that is really dangerous. So there's something about the anonymity of being online where you see much more of the kind of contentious rhetoric coming out of people, which would never happen if these were in-person dialogues.
Right.
Yeah. So
I agree. I think with social media, at least my own research was around, building trust cross-national.
Sure.
So many companies have moved everything to, online communications and Zoom and the like. And I think it's going to swing back to face-to-face, because I think that's where real trust is built.
Yes, absolutely. And I know for you as a professor, just seeing the faces in the room, seeing how they react, realizing if someone's confused or where you would need to elaborate or maybe try to be more convincing on a particular topic. I mean, it's clear that the advantages are there and necessary.
Sure, absolutely. So Mai'a, we're going to end with a piece of advice. What piece of advice would you give the global business leaders listening?
Sure. I mean, as a non-business leader myself, it's a little challenging, but I would come back to this notion of, diplomacy does not have to be just practiced by professional diplomats who work in foreign ministries or the State Department. That diplomacy can be something for everyone. And I think global business leaders are uniquely positioned to engage in this. They can, especially in fluid situations where technology is changing, they can help to define kind of the parameters of what is valuable to them and what is valuable to society. And they can also listen to people and have, again, the pulse of global public opinion. And they can choose and strategize business practices based on, what human society needs and wants. It's important, and I'm sure they're all aware already, to pay attention to demand. And I think in our world today, there are so many areas in which we see emerging aspirational ideas for a better world. And that's where, if global business leaders are able to really understand that and take that into account as they think about building a sense of diplomatic participation and cooperation, that they will be ahead of the game.
Yeah, and amplify those core values. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Mai'a, your book sounds fantastic. Where can people find it?
Probably the easiest way to find my book, International Cooperation Against All Odds, The Ultra-Social World, is on Amazon, and it's also available at the Oxford University Press website.
Terrific. Mai'a, thank you so much for being a guest on International Business Today.
Of course. You're welcome.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us for today's episode of International Business Today. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your network. As always, we'd love to hear from you.